All righty then. I got the go. We are a go. Folks, welcome to the Writers for Rights Community Circle. This week, we will be discussing New York City public schools and the fight for Black liberation. We've got a really great run of show this evening. We have a special guest with us, Ronnie Almonte. And let's get those slides. That's who we are. We're Writers for Rights on Instagram at writers number 4 rights. Next slide, please. All right. So we're going to get things started with a quote from James Baldwin, which reads, "History is not a procession of illustrious people. It is what happens to a people. Millions of anonymous people is what history is about." Kind of let that sit with you for a little bit. And then also we can kind of use this quote as it sits with you. You want to do a little grounding, kind of, just take a look at see what's in your space and what's distracting you. And you want to do like some up stretches, some of these. I'll read the quote one more time. "History is not a procession of illustrious people. It is what happens to a people. Millions of anonymous people is what history is about." All right. Also, just one more thing. We will be recording the presentation parts of this. So if you don't want to be seen, you're welcome to turn your camera off. And then when we get to the open mic, we won't be doing that. But just so we have it, because we're gonna have some good things that are said during this, and we'd like to have it. Yes. So next slide, please. So tonight's agenda was our introduction. We're going to go over some community agreements. Then we have a presentation by Ronnie Almonte. Then there will be a Q&A. And then there'll be a presentation by someone named Lil Bite. And then we're going to have some breakout groups where there are questions to be answered. And then an open mic to discuss the questions that were talked about in the breakout groups. Next slide. All right. So some community agreements that we have. The first is to again, these are not rules. They're just merely suggestions. The first one is stay engaged. And on that, thing I'll do is kind of get things off of my desk that I don't need at the moment. Truly, like be here now, and experience discomfort is another one. And then we have speak your truth, expect and accept non-closure, language matters, one mic, step up, and wait. And wait can be translated to why am I talking right now, or why aren't I talking right now? Usually the why aren't I talking right now is the one I have to answer for myself. It's usually anxiety. And then what's shared here stays here, and what's learned here leaves here. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, can we go back to that slide? Sorry. Do we want to just do some pluses in the chat if these things are you, or just some thumbs up or yes? Wonderful. All the pluses, 3 pluses. All right, next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Coach. I'm a member of Writers for Rights and also a public school teacher. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker. Ronnie Almonte is a public school teacher in Brooklyn. He is a member of the Movement and Rank and File Educators More caucus of our union. In his spare time, he is an avid birder and photographer. So he spends a lot of his time in the parks of New York City enjoying our amazing residents, the birds. And without further ado, take it away, Ronnie.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'm gonna be chilling for like the next hour and a half.
Should there be someone who's muted? Okay, thank you. Okay, we cool to get started? Okay, groovy. Okay, hey y'all. Again, I'm Ronnie Almonte. I am so excited to be talking to you about something that's always on my mind and something that I always talk about. It feels like with the people around me because I'm a New York City school teacher, and the issues of my kids who I see every day, especially in this past year, the issues that they're grappling with, and all of us are, is something that's always in my kind of in my headspace, and it very much I think dictates and guides and occupies my feelings, my thoughts, my mind. So next slide, please. I'm gonna be talking about just a general kind of like what's on my mind in terms of the New York City school system. Some of the things that I want to talk about primarily are how much of an injustice Black and brown kids and white kids as well are enduring in the school system. And the flip side, the other side of the coin is really like how this profession has been made more difficult, challenging. And I want to kind of illustrate how these kind of twin miseries, right, actually come from a single source. And that's the system itself as much. And my kind of role today is to articulate exactly what that system is and why it functions the way it does, and why the certain actors inside of the system, how are they incentivized? Why are they incentivized to do what they do? De Blasio, the governor, the capitalist class, and so on and so forth. The union bureaucracies. So we're going to have to look at a little bit of history, I think, to answer those questions. And of course, I think the main purpose of this talk today is for us to actually, have something to then go out in the streets with, that can guide our actions, our activities, that can kind of create for us an idea of what is winnable, and what is just, and be kind of motivated, both motivated, but also kind of educated, to fight for a better school system, which I'm a socialist, so for me that's going to mean fighting for simultaneously kind of a better world, because schools don't exist in vacuums. So just a kind of a landscape, right, or a survey of what the schools look like today. I think these bullet points here are some of the, if I could just like boil down what the school system is, I think these start to get at, I think, all the threads that I think we should be thinking about. Who's in the schools? Well, it's mostly Black and brown students, in particular Latinx students. Who else is in the schools? Well, it's mostly white teachers, right? A lot of the staff, and a lot of important staff, all staff are important, but in particular paraprofessionals, who play a tremendous role in supporting and providing individualized support in students in their classrooms. They're overwhelmingly, they're disproportionately Black and Latinx, and during the pandemic, they've actually died at some of the highest rates among school workers. So that's who's in the schools. What is the school system? How are students distributed in the school system? Well, it's the most segregated school system in the country, both racially and academically as well. The school system is very segregated. There are schools that have extremely very high performing students in terms of how they perform on exams, for example. And those schools they're able to use their resources in more diverse ways, compared to schools where there's a concentration of students with very high academic needs, and a disproportionate amount of those individual schools' resources go into supporting that development. So we have academic segregation, which means students are concentrated in ways that are academic, and they're also racially segregated as well. There are very few schools that are actually like, and I taught in one school, and there's really only a few that are just like, a quarter Black, a quarter white, a quarter Latinx, a quarter Asian. Okay, so how do you get into this schools? Well, a quarter of high schools are what's called screened. So, the way that screening proponents talk about it, it's like, schools get to select, who gets into their, who's enrolled in their schools. So this is great, they argue, because if students are like really good at science, they can go to like a science-based high school. If they're really good at writing, they can go to a writing-based high school. That's really not how it works. Screening is not about who gets in, it's about who is excluded. I think that's the way we have to that should be our starting point in thinking about screened schools. So a quarter of them, like I said, quarter of high schools are screened. And a lot of middle schools are too, and elementary schools are as well. I mean, if you think of gifted and talented programs, that's included, right, in screening. And we can talk more a little later about exactly how schools are screened, because some, until recently, were screened based on geography. Like literally, like if you are part of District 2, then which is like the village in the Upper East Side, then your kids get the priority admission into these schools that are obviously more funded, right, in this gerrymandered district. Yeah. So that's a way of kind of like excluding students from other parts of the city access by keeping schools in a gerrymandered white district white. Okay, and then how are schools funded? This is actually a really important question that I'm gonna spend some time on later talking about, because the way that schools are funded right now, it incentivizes like pushing veteran teachers out and producing like low quality conditions for learning for students. I'll just say, like right now, like one of the most striking statistics is that New York City schools are actually owed at least $1 billion in what's called fair student funding, a formula that itself is very conservative. Schools actually need a lot more, but even by their own shitty standards, they still are not funding the schools in their own right-wing Bloomberg, neoliberal corporate ed reform equation. It's really bananas. Okay, so that's kind of like a survey of what the school system looks like. By the way, every student has to apply to a high school. Like you don't get like in the mail, like, hey, this is your local school, you go to that. No, you literally have to sit down as a family and pick the top 12 or whatever high schools you want to get into. You have to apply to go to high school in New York City. Okay, next slide, please. I just kind of want to look at this a little bit more. One, because I'm a Black educator, and two, it speaks volumes about, I think the state of education in this country. So in New York City, this is, you can like look at the source later, and I can drop the link to the article. As a science teacher, sources are very important to me. So I got you. I'll drop that a little bit later. But in blue are, as you can see, are the percentage of students in the school, in the New York City public school system, and then in yellow is the percentage of teachers by race in the New York City public school system. So something that may strike you is that the tallest yellow bar, which is teachers, is white. Right, so white teachers are actually 58%, which means that they're the majority of teachers. But they are not the majority at all. They're actually the smallest population of students in the New York City public school system. So this is a tremendous disparity. And of course, we see that as a result, every POC group of teachers is underrepresented compared to the percentage of students in the school system. What you don't see here, because this is just a single snapshot in time, is that the number of Black teachers in particular has actually been declining for at least a decade. So there are fewer and fewer of these Black teachers. Why? We can, again, talk more about it a little bit later, but let me throw this out. So especially during the height of especially during Bush with No Child Left Behind, but especially under Obama as well, both Bush and Obama created policies that actually, I think, incentivized the pushing out of Black teachers. At this point, I hope that we know how, at least the limits of the Obama administration. I actually want to argue that the Obama administration reproduced white supremacy across the entire country in every institution, being the leader of a settler colonial empire. But in particular, Barack Obama and his administration was not just no friend, but an enemy to public education. When the Chicago teachers went on strike in 2012, Obama had campaigns saying that if anyone ever went on strike, then I would take out my strike shoes and join you. He was never there. I was there in Chicago, and there were in the rallies and protests, where's the Democratic Party? Obama, where are you? Never showed up, never said anything. Why? Well, because it's the Democratic Party. They ran Chicago, and they still do in every other big city. But also, I'm sure at some level, the mayor of Chicago was Rahm Emanuel, right? Who was Obama's former chief of staff, who's a big fundraising guy in the Democratic Party. So what does this have to do with everything? Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind really punished schools, even closed schools down if they weren't performing high enough. So instead of actually funding education, they kind of took advantage of the outcomes, what I'm going to argue, the outcomes of segregation. And since Black teachers are more likely to want to and actually be in Black and brown schools, when those failing schools got turned around because of No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, again, Obama's corporate neoliberal ed reform policy, it was Black teachers who are more likely to actually get fired or be pushed out of the occupation in some indirect way. Anyway, that's, I think, a piece of the puzzle for why the number of Black teachers is declining. But we need more research and evidence, but I think that's a big part of it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in continuing talking about the state of education in New York City today, I want to pay some attention to this kind of hot topic or issue, and that's around the specialized high schools. Specialized high schools, there are about 8 or 9 of them in New York City. They are literally, on paper, an elite kind of tier of the public school system. Still public, but they are designed to be elite. So yes, we literally have codified a tiered public school education within a single school district or system. This is not uncommon. Most kind of big cities, especially in the 50s and 60s, they they created these selective enrollment and magnet schools or enhanced them in order to kind of keep the white population right in the cities and kind of prevent them from white flight. They didn't really work or anything like that. And it's something that's kind of taboo to say now. That's why when mayoral candidate Andrew Yang said as much, he said, no, we need to keep the specialized high schools because they keep white families here. He was kind of saying the thing that you never say out loud. But it is worth talking about these schools, although they only make up 8 or 9. They only make up just a tiny, tiny fraction of the actual school population. The reason they're so important to talk about too is because the very mere existence of them kind of but it enhances the competition that already exists in the public school system, both for enrollment and for enrollment. So the fact that they exist, creates kind of okay, so in order for me to get into to these specialized high schools, I need to compete in order to get into these like 10 middle schools that from the majority of which, the specialized high schools draw from, which means that for each of these 10 middle school feeder schools, I should really pay attention to which elementary schools and I send my kids to, because those are, you see what I'm saying? Like there's created this kind of network where from the very get-go, elementary school and gifted and talented programs, you're calculating as a parent where you're going to place your kid, and you're competing for seats in these particular elementary and middle schools, so that your kid has a shot by the time that they're fucking 12 and 13 to get into a specialized high school. It's really anyway, I kind of make that point because a lot of proponents of the specialized high schools kind of deflect, and they say, well, we're only a few schools. Why don't you, there are other schools that are whiter. There are other schools that are wealthy, that have student populations wealthier. Why pick on us? Well, one, two wrongs don't make a right. And two, the mere existence of tiered schooling, of which you are a tremendous part, actually kind of creates this incentive to track students from the very beginning of their education. So the specialized high schools include Brooklyn Tech, where Jamani Williams, the public advocate, went to high school, who unfortunately very much defends the specialized high schools. The way that specialized high schools work is that there's actually just a single test that you have to take. The problem is, some of the problems are that, so the test is called the SHSAT. Some of the challenges in just merely sitting for the test is that you have to opt into it, and you take it only outside of school hours. The specialized high schools, originally there were 3, which includes Brooklyn Tech, Stuyvesant, and Bronx Science, I believe. And now there are about 8 that use the SHSAT as an enrollment feature criterion. So even those who advocate, a majority of which were open under Bloomberg, so recently. So a lot of those who advocate, including Yang, but also Jamani Williams, open more specialized high schools, right? Problem is we did that already, and the numbers haven't changed because there's something structurally built right into this system that produces these unequal, racist, frankly, outcomes. And the problem's been getting worse since for decades. In the middle of the 1980s, Brooklyn Tech was about half Black. The student population was half Black. Now it's about 6%. Okay, I didn't, in case you think I said something wrong, no. 1985, Brooklyn Tech, half student population, 51% of the population was Black. Now it's 6%. That's a tremendous decline, obviously. Last year, Stuyvesant High School, which is the most selective specialized high school, they made offers, maybe this was 2 years ago, they made offers to only 7 Black students out of 895 spots. So 7 out of 895 invitations went to Black students. I don't know what the number was last year, but I'm sure it was still in the single digits. Maybe 9 were offered spots. I don't know. Next slide, please. It's really no surprise if you just know a little bit of recent history and choose to not kind of put it in, to hide it. The SHSAT, again, the single criterion, this entrance exam for the specialized high schools, It was actually enshrined into law in 1971. It's actually a law that these elite schools have to use this test as the only criterion. It was passed in order to kind of evade or block the diversification of the specialized high schools. So the law is called Het Calandra. You might have seen this maybe on social media or in protests with our signs like, repeal Het Calandra. It's what protects the specialized high schools. And what it did was it actually protected them from a looming city investigation into racial discrimination. Something that was kind of being done across the country and actually happened in Chicago. So New York City was able to get away with not really being investigated by the federal government. And now we have the most segregated school system in the country. But other school districts, luckily, weren't let off. So Chicago, I go back to Chicago. Chicago was not able to avoid integration mandates, luckily. So in 1980, the city of Chicago and the federal government agreed to use race, not free lunch, not income, to use actual race, Black, Brown, Latinx, Asian, as a factor in admissions to their magnet and selective enrollment schools. And diversity in those elite public schools in Chicago actually increased. In contrast to New York City, where since the passage of Het Calandra, ultimately there has been a tremendous decline in the number of Black students in the New York City elite schools. It's a tremendous disparity. One thing to keep in mind is that Chicago, because of a Supreme Court case in 2007, Chicago was told you can't use race anymore. And they were like, okay, we'll use economics as a proxy. And the number of Black students actually declined, even which to me shows that if you want to integrate, you have to use race. You can't use a proxy. It's not good enough. We actually have to confront what the issue is and talk about this. Now, in a lot of ways, that goes against the spirit of at least like maybe a very liberal interpretation of the civil rights movement. That was very much like, let's not judge each other by the color of our skin. Let us kind of maybe overlook race. Obviously, that didn't mean for the majority of Black civil rights leaders, it didn't mean like ignore me and ignore my color. Quite the opposite. But I feel like like white liberals looked at it that way, and so even to this day, even within socialist circles, and I'm going to argue, and I argue like, probably like around Jacobin magazine and parts of DSA, there is, I think, this kind of like, let's avoid race-based demands, let's avoid, race-based language, for fear of alienating, right? Whatever that means. So we see that, I think, very much across the political spectrum, this kind of so-called like race-neutral kind of politics. In my own union, the UFT, has and continues to, I think, adopt this outlook. And that's actually a really important part. When the UFT acted on that, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, when they acted on that in the 60s and this past year, it actually came at a tremendous cost to public education. So again, I'll kind of bring that up a little bit later. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, water's good. Okay, so I just briefly started talking about my union, the United Federation of Teachers, which has a membership of about 150,000. people, including teachers, paraprofessionals, other staff, nurses, social workers, people like that. So this is a union, the UFT, that it actually isn't the first teachers union in New York City. The UFT is the first union recognized by the city, the first and only a teachers union recognized by the city, and it is the main bargaining agent, right, of New York City teachers and school workers. But there was a union before the UFT. It was a small one, but it was a very important one, and it laid the foundation for, in a lot of ways, I think, the UFT's own existence, and it I think laid a foundation for us in this Zoom call today to think about the right way to fight for public education that is actually like both centers like labor rights and more race-based kind of demands, and actually sees those two things not as like separate things, not that we fight for wages and pensions and then we do something nice for our Black kids. That ain't it. That's not what we're doing. There is a material interest, I think, in both the desegregation movement historically and the and teacher unionism. There's a material interest in both of them existing and fighting. And so I want to argue today that those movements should be intertwined, and that there's a tremendous cost when they're separated, which exists today to a great extent, a separation that is neither natural nor inevitable. It was actually manufactured. And to really understand that, we have to look at history. So the first, I think, broadly conceived teachers union was in New York City was literally called Teachers Union, the TU, New York City Teachers Union. It was founded in, I think, 1916 or 17, right when the US entered the First World War. The TU fought for representation. Okay, remember, they weren't a recognized union. They weren't the majority of school workers. So during this time, the TU was fighting to be recognized as a union and fighting for, labor rights, protections, tenure, and they were also fighting for racial justice. The book on this history is by Clarence Taylor, a historian who is Black, and he wrote a book called Reds at the Blackboard, Reds at the Blackboard, and that is the single authoritative study on the TU. The TU in 1935, I believe it was, so this is in the middle of the labor upheaval in this country. The Communist Party is really leading the way in and had been in organizing in key industries and auto and longshore work, but also in the public sector here in New York City. So by 1935, the membership of the TU actually elect communist and communist-aligned teachers to leadership. This was not acceptable to a minority of those teachers. So they broke off with that democratic decision to have this leadership. And then they founded what's called the Teachers Guild, which eventually basically became the main part of what's the UFT is today. So the UFT was actually born out of anti-communism. And that's just something to keep in mind in this talk. The UFT was, again, born out of anti-communism. And for me, in my reading of history, anti-communism is very much a Jim Crow, very much a anti kind of militant kind of posture. So, for a lot of complicated reasons, the TU was and its members were attacked. Remember, a lot of the membership probably the majority weren't communists. No, not probably, like definitely the majority weren't communists. We had thousands of members, I think maybe 4,000 or 5 at its peak. Definitely the majority were not communists or Communist Party members. Still, the TU was targeted by the NYPD, by the FBI, by the Board of Education, and the rest of the labor movement at this point, led by giants like Walter Reuther of the UAW and things like that. They very much at this point, by the 40s and really the late 40s, early 50s, had kind of made their peace with anti-communism and joined the bandwagon in an effort to kind of themselves avoid being attacked. So they joined essentially the enemy. And so it was also convenient for them, isolating the pain in the neck, militants and rank and file communists who are a thorn in their sides and their conception of unionism, right? Being kind of just like backroom dealing and bargaining, behind closed doors. Anyway, so the labor movement, unfortunately, and under conservative leadership, really set up rank and filers, communists, who oftentimes were the most militant anti-racists in the labor movement. They were set up, for being targeted and punished. Around, I think 300 teachers almost lost their jobs. One had actually committed suicide died by suicide from the harassment from the NYPD and FBI. The Feinberg Law, which was a fucking law in New York State, it made it illegal in New York State for communists to be public school teachers. Ultimately, the TU was very weakened by this. There are reasons, I think, strategically and politically, why the TU also, failed. But we can't underestimate the role of the state and its power in demoralizing and gutting this really important, I think, movement for public education. So the TU eventually dissolved in 1964, about 3 years after the UFT won its first contract. They called it quits and told its members to join the UFT and form kind of an opposition pole within the UFT leadership. Work that we continue to this day. You can go to the next slide. By the way, this won't be my last time talking about either the UFT or the TU, because we're going to talk, about some heavy shit that happened in the 60s in New York City. So before we get there, we still have to kind of be in the 50s right now. So, there's been an integration movement in the city. It's had its, highs and lows, but it's been here for as far back as the 50s, at least. This is when the integration movement really starts to, I think, get a lot of attention. The kind of centers of the integration movement in the 50s was Brooklyn and Harlem. This is, around the time of the national civil rights movement, right? The Montgomery bus boycott and things like that. They're happening at this moment. And usually when we read about the civil rights movement, the story starts in the South. Sure, the South was the epicenter of that, but the civil rights movement was also here in New York simultaneously. And schools were a big part of that movement. Always have been, right? 1954 was Brown versus Board of Ed. You can argue that the modern civil rights movement was very much ignited because of a public school matter, issue. Some of the things that were being fought for in the 50s, some of the demands were busing. You guessed it, busing. Unfortunately, the way that busing did look in New York City, when that demand was sort of one, it was almost always Black children, right, being moved, having to take on the burden of being transported to the always structurally less crowded white schools. It was never the other way around. We know that there have been lots of problems, just to take a step back here, in our efforts to integrate the school system in this country. I do think it's a demand worth it. The thing is, integration has never really, integration has worked in places where especially if you look at school districts where, integration happens and then it was rolled back. Students who were exposed to more years in an integrated school setting actually have like higher educational, academic, and economic outcomes than in particular Black students who were in segregated schools. So integration did work to some extent, but it largely, especially in urban settings, did not work the way that we want it to work, because it was not done under our terms. It was not done with our power and our decision making. It was not done collectively from the grassroots. It was done on our behalf, and fuck that. If we want to actually win and reform the system, then we're going to have to fight for it ourselves and dictate the terms in which these reforms will happen. Reforms, in short of a revolution, of course. So, when we demand integration, we're not saying close, all the Black and brown schools and then, let those Black teachers and school workers out of a job. No, that's not what we're saying. And that's not inevitable when it comes to integration. So when we fight for integration, we should be fighting it for it on our terms. So some of the demands at this time included busing, redrawing school district lines. There's, to this day, school districts are essentially gerrymandered. If you look at District 2 and 3, District 2 is drawn around a set of projects in the Lower East Side. It's just so blatant that it's unbelievable. So redrawing school district lines in ways that are, that produce racial balance. Building new schools is what they were fighting for. Building new schools on the boundaries between racially divided communities. Eventually, this integration movement culminated into what was actually the largest civil rights demonstration in US history. Okay, and that was the February 3rd boycott of 1964, where almost 500,000 students, Black students, chose not to go to school. Okay, their families were like, we are not, to send a message, we are not going to let our Black students go into these segregated school systems for this one day. Imagine how powerful that would be today. That's something I think we should definitely be considering, is organizing this kind of boycott. Unfortunately, like the boycott in a lot of ways was kind of like the last gasp of air for the integration movement, the last kind of hurrah. And we'll get into exactly what we mean by that in just a little while. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so here's here's a photo of an example of some of that busing that we were talking about. I do think busing is important, but again, it has to be done kind of on our terms. It's not, and I went to a white public school, so I understand the trauma of being one of the few people of color, especially Black students in the predominantly white district. It was almost as if the policymakers didn't want integration, so they made it as miserable of an experience as possible in order to discredit it. Anyway, I should say that this boycott in 1964, the UFT, again, my union, was asked to endorse this boycott. They said no. Why? Oh, because it would be a violation of our contract and that would be illegal. Okay, but the UFT has been on strike at least 5 times, at least 6 times, in 1960, 61, 67, 68, 75. In 68, it was actually 3 strikes, so that's 7 by my count. All those were illegal. Every strike, and you have struck, was illegal. but you wouldn't go on strike for this movement. Just call it what it is, you know. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just some more photos. I just felt it was important to include like the actual kind of photos and faces of the people in this movement. This isn't anything abstract. This was an actual movement, and these are, our, in a sense, our ancestors, right? It's around this time, there were also these different so-called taxpayer organizations propping up. I don't even have to tell you, I think, what their role was. Just by their names, they would name themselves, we are the Parents and Taxpayers Association. They didn't want Black kids in their schools, you know, just point blank. So some of the first were in Queens, like in the Jackson Heights area. They very much opposed this. I don't have a picture of it, but they led these kinds of like white taxpayer organizations, white supremacist organizations, essentially. They like would lead protests. They, in 1964, in the beginning, after this boycott in March, a month later, thousands of white women marched over the Brooklyn Bridge, and they said, no, don't integrate. No, we don't want niggers here. No, blah, 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 right? And if you look at the kind of the debates in Congress in 1964 around the Civil Rights Act, they're actually talking about this. They're talking about these white women and some men, you know, protesting against integration. And in the debates for the Civil Rights Act, the like liberals from the North are trying to like create kind of exemptions for themselves by using language, like making up language, like oh, okay, there are actually kinds of segregation. There's like de jure segregation, which is what you're doing in the South by actually codifying it into law, and then there's de facto segregation, which is just like a natural, just like from economics, from neighborhood segregation. So you know, the Northern liberals, they create this language that basically exempts them from integration. And it's so obvious that Southern racist segregationists are in Congress talking about shit, like you senator from New York, you're more of a segregationist than me. Like this was just so blatant. All these loopholes that Northern legislators were creating for themselves. So the Civil Rights Act actually doesn't allow for like busing and things like that to be used if it's for if it's to correct a racial imbalance, right? Integration mandates are only appropriate if the school district is literally you know, using race as a factor to exclude students from schools, right? So, which is hard to prove also, right? Not that you can't, but it's hard to prove. You have to like actually be like, no, see, like these people were deciding, you know, based on my kids and this student's, this population's skin color, that they should go to that school. That's hard to prove. But, you know, if you can also, if you just say, well, you know, it's their income, you know, or they live over there, you know, then it's that, it's not race, it's their geography. It's all these things that are racialized in our country. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the integration movement, like I was saying, it kind of had its last hurrah with the boycott. And that boycott itself, it didn't actually produce anything concrete in terms of reforms. And there was actually a second boycott in March that was organized. But a lot of Black liberals, including the NAACP, were like, nah, we're not gonna go for this again. You know, you're on your own. Who stepped in though? Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X, who, you know, is often thought of as like, oh, you know, he wanted separation. He don't want anything to do with this. It's like, that's complete bullshit. Like Malcolm X, and if you look on YouTube, Malcolm X, like 1964 student boycott, you'll see videos of him talking to people, and there's just like one white journalist who's like, well, aren't you a segregationist? And Malcolm X like, okay, dude, I'm for, no, in his Malcolm X way, it's like, no, I'm for separation. I'm not for segregation. And I thought that spoke volumes, and that was a really smart. Anyway, what we're seeing here, and the reason I also bring up Malcolm X, besides the fact that he's just so awesome, was that we're seeing this movement kind of take more of a radical turn, right? We see that in the civil rights movement in general, in a lot of ways, within individuals, like MLK, for example, really radicalized. And in terms of like the broader movement itself, you think of SNCC, radicalizing, and you think of Black Power, the Black Power movement, and things like that. So the movement for public education in this city also, in my opinion, radicalized. And so instead of, not that there's anything inherently not radical about fighting for integration, it just depends. But integration could not be won at this moment. So kind of a current within the movement kind of fought for what's called community control of schools, a theme very much in tune with, I think, the Black Power movement, right? Like control over our own communities. And, a section of people were like, that includes our schools. And so, I do want to stress, though, that this movement came out of the failure of the integration movement. And I'm of the belief that a lot of the Black Power movement was, I think, forward moving, but a lot of it also came out of just inevitably out of a retreat, I think, out of frustration of not being able to win really, really much in this country. I shouldn't say maybe not much. We won a lot, but clearly not enough. And MLK, would go as much as to say that as well, and very much fought for, kind of centering economic justice, is the way that he would phrase it, toward the end of his life. So community control becomes kind of like the form in which the movement for public education takes shape. Next slide, please. And so, what happens is that the city starts to kind of respond in its own way, in a way that is more to the right, of course, than what the movement had really fought for. But the city does kind of, in some way, respond to this and pilots a so-called decentralized model of community control in 3 neighborhoods, which include Ocean Hill, Brownsville, or I just put OHB in the slides for short. So I think one was in Harlem, the other was in Two Bridges, by the Lower East Side, and the third one was in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, here in Brooklyn. So basically what that looked like was that a school district was created in that community, in those communities, and families actually elected a local board in charge of administering the schools within that district, which would include like a high school or two, a couple of middle schools, and a bunch of elementary schools. This was really powerful, and it was by no means clear. It was almost deliberately left ambiguous exactly how much power these local boards would have. They wanted power to fire and hire and to control finances. That's actual power. Of course, the DOE, the city never put it that way. But this was something that was always like negotiated. It's always a power struggle. So in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, here in the neighborhood in Brooklyn, families elected a local board in charge of administering these schools, and they hired a pipe smoking man named Rhodey McCoy as its superintendent. And the UFT and a lot of the teachers, who were mostly white, in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, they really resented this experiment. They saw it as an infringement. The UFT in particular saw it as an infringement over their control over their management of the school system. And white teachers really resented what they thought of as like letting Black communities kind of like run rampant in the school system. So after a year of this experiment, and after a year of local tensions, citywide tensions between a lot of white teachers and Black families, Black and Latinx, and a lot of Puerto Rican families, Rhodey McCoy decides to transfer 12 white teachers out of the district. The UFT claims that they were fired without due process. And this becomes like the main reason that the UFT uses for going on strike 3 times that fall. Now, mind you that involuntary transfers had happened at this time, like for other reasons. It was just something that was done. But when this Black local board does it, the UFT claims that they're fired, which they weren't. Fired without due process, okay? And this is the reason, the UFT leadership headed by President Albert Shanker, important name in this history, in the history of teacher unionism in general in this country. Albert Shanker says they were fired without due process. He uses the language of labor rights against civil rights, which I think sets a really dangerous precedent, but is a natural outcome of this kind of Cold War liberalism, race neutral kind of understanding for how society should work. Next slide, please. So we started off this meeting with a quote from James Baldwin. James Baldwin actually had something to say about this strike. He was a New York City public school system student when he was obviously younger, having grown up uptown in Harlem. James Baldwin basically wrote that these strikes by my union were racist strikes, that they were meant to intimidate the Black community into submission to the white status quo. He had written that Rhoda McCoy, by the way, was eventually fired without due process by the city. And by the way, just a reminder that the UFT went on strike 3 times. Albert Shanker claimed that these teachers were fired, which they weren't, without due process. And he goes on strike. At some point in the strike, his demand becomes fire the Black locally, democratically elected Black superintendent of the Ocean Hill Brownsville School, fire him without due process. So the contradictions are just so obvious if you kind of just look at it. Anyway, James Baldwin writes that Rhoda McCoy's dismissal of those 12 white teachers, meant that he thought he had the right to dismiss them, that he had no such right, had to be made immediately and abundantly clear, not only to protect the power of the United Federation of Teachers, but also to prevent any of the billions of dollars involved in the education business from being controlled by Black and Puerto Rican communities. Therefore, the head of the UFT, Albert Shanker, called the city-wide strike. This was to put McCoy in his place and to make certain that his exercise of authority would not constitute a precedent. Okay, that's what it was about. It wasn't about due process. It was a strike against the civil rights movement in New York City. It was unfortunately the most, out of all UFT strikes, it was the one that was the most participated. So over 95% of teachers participated, walked the picket lines. This is in contrast to the UFT's first strike, where 5% of teachers, walked the picket lines. Over 95% of the UFT actually walked the picket lines against this strike. It wasn't over wages, it wasn't over pensions, it was against community control. Now, I want to talk about who supported this strike and why. So if you look at the papers, the Black officials in the labor movement, including like the famous A. Philip Randolph, they actually support the UFT. They support Albert Shanker, which allows him to also better hide the fact that this strike is against the civil rights movement in New York City. So the labor officials, the bureaucrats, they're sticking together, Black and white. I think what's more interesting and it hasn't been written much. And unfortunately, I think I'm one of the few who's actually like researched and written about Black teachers and what they were thinking about this strike. They actually crossed the picket line. Now, I know as lefties, we're like, you never cross a picket line. And that's a good rule of thumb. But especially in this country that is so racist through and through, you know, there are racist strikes bound to happen. And those are the ones that we do not honor. And this was an example of a racist strike. And we see both Black teachers and also, and some of them are communists, but also communist teachers. Remember the TU that I talked about, what feels like maybe years ago? You know, again, like those teachers came out of that. These communist teachers or former communist teachers, they came out of an early form of unionism that was, you know, racial justice oriented. So their instincts were good. They were trained right. They were able to clearly identify a racist strike, and they did what was just, in my opinion, and that's not to honor this racist strike and to cross the picket lines, because crossing the picket line in 1968 during the Ocean Hill-Brownsville strike, during this white racist strike, meant that you showed solidarity to the Black and brown community of New York City. Okay, and what eventually happens, unfortunately, is that none of that is enough. So the UFT eventually wins its strike. Albany eliminates the community control experiments, and it dissolves the local boards that these Black and brown families voted for. Okay, next slide, please. Something important did come out of this strike, though, and that was a Black caucus. And it is what it sounds like. It's a group of Black educators within the union. So there isn't really much in the history books about the Black caucus, unfortunately. The Black Caucus of the UFT was founded in the course of the Ocean Hill-Brownsville strike by UFT Vice President Richard Parrish. It goes without saying that he wasn't UFT Vice President for long. Schenker had control over this union and eventually pushed Richard Parrish out. But the Black Caucus is founded at this time and their demands included demanding that the Board of Education open the schools back up because they had been shut down by the strike. They expressed their support for Rhodey McCoy. They actually, these UFT members, these Black UFT members also come out against Albert Schenker in calling his actions irresponsible. And they come out in support of community control, the Black Caucus. So this is a really interesting development. And it's quite baffling that there isn't much history written about these Black educators, these ordinary Black educators who, in contrast to the Black union leaders in the city, overwhelmingly opposed this racist strike. Next slide, please. Okay, so eventually the Black Caucus, they in New York City, they come to see that these problems around race in the union are actually nationwide in scope, and so there should be Black caucuses and yeah, I'll wrap up soon, my bad, and that there should be Black caucuses across the city. And so just for the sake of time, I guess I'll just skip this part, but some of the things that the AFT Black Caucus does is they support different resolutions, like the AFT should support Angela Davis and things like that. Next slide. Next one. Okay, I'll end by just talking about Bloomberg because this is another turning point in history, in the history of public education. Some of the things that Bloomberg does is that any pretense of democracy in the school system was completely thrown out. he secured what's called mayoral control. It is what it sounds like. The mayor literally has control over the entire school system. For example, de Blasio, right? The reason we're all like, especially in the pandemic last year, we're all like looking at de Blasio and watching his, his press conferences is because he's the one who decides. If we had an actually democratically elected school board in this country, made up of the people who actually are served, then perhaps we could have closed the schools a week earlier, which would have saved tens of thousands of lives. Schools at de Blasio kept open, right? Because for de Blasio, keeping the schools open is the way of forcing workers to go out and make profit rather than actually taxing the rich and paying people to stay home. So Bloomberg secures mayoral control, which de Blasio, continues to happily push for and enjoy. Bloomberg makes admissions more selective. He allows the percentage of screen programs to increase from 15 to almost 29%. I think crucially, Bloomberg reformed the way that schools were budgeted, so that a school's budget was no longer tied to its resource and hiring needs, but it was based on the formula, that fair student formula that I was talking about earlier, that is based on the characteristics of the students, which sounds nice, but it isn't actually the way that it kind of looks like on paper. And so what this means is that, and also what happens is that each school's budget, they have to actually pay for teacher salaries rather than just a central system paying for the salaries. So this incentivizes principals in order to kind of cut corners and save a few bucks. It incentivizes them to actually push out more expensive veteran teachers with more experience, teachers that we should be keeping in the system, and for the benefit of our students and our newer teachers so that they can get that mentorship. They're actually now incentivized to be pushed out, which lowers the quality, I think, of education for everyone. So, Bloomberg did create a system of school choice. That was the rhetoric that he, expounded. We want parents to have a choice. Well, you did create a system of school choice, but it wasn't, the choice was not for parents and students. The choice was one where elite schools and principals, were given the choice on which teachers to hire and which students to enroll, without regard to fairness and equity. And can we go to the next slide, please? So I think the demands that maybe we can talk about in breakouts and that we can debate, all screening should, I think, end. We shouldn't have gifted and talented programs. We should abolish the SHSAT and the specialized school system. By abolishing the test in particular, the outsized impact of unfair advantages would be minimized. Abolishing the SHSAT, it would help level, I think, the playing field, although it would hardly equalize it. It's much bigger than the specialized high schools. We need to, integrate the school system academically as well. And Teens Take Charge has, I think, done a lot of good work in envisioning what this would look like, mixing students based on their, on some of their state exam scores, in order to academically integrate. Reform the budget so that schools' budgets are amply funded and that they are based on resource and hiring needs and not some like gimmick formula. And tax the rich. This all requires money. Integration requires money. Gates, Bezos, they made billions and billions of dollars. They already have billions and trillions among themselves, so they don't deserve any of it. We're asking for something modest, and that's just give us more, a little bit more. And of course, democratize the school system. We need the power to decide, so that if we want to integrate, if we want to fund our schools, if we want to change the curriculum, it's on our terms. And just the next slide, please. If there is a next slide with a picture, there's not.
Sorry, I changed the order really quickly. Sorry.
It's okay. Never mind. Then that's I think that's it for me then. So thank you so much. I know that went a while, but there's a lot to say. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ronnie. Let's show him some love in the chat. I know personally, this is not the first time I've heard you speak, and every time I hear you speak, I learn something more about the history of my profession and unions and like how I can continue to fight for my students to give them the schools that we know they deserve. So again, we're so happy that you were able to speak with us and share all of your incredible knowledge. So we are going to give you all an opportunity to talk to each other about your experiences in school. Talking about education, not everyone is an educator or in education, but we all did go to school. So we have a few questions here. We will put them in the chat for you as we go into breakout rooms. You're also free to just discuss with the people in your group any questions we have for Ronnie or reactions to his incredible presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and open up those rooms.